Today we're going to talk about unity and variety and some of the principles of Gestalt that we can use in order to achieve both unity and variety in a composition. These terms are a little bit difficult to define. We're going to attempt to do that in the next half hour or so here. But they're pretty easy to show, fortunately. And I've chosen a room in a high-tech style to give an example of a composition that seemed to express a lot of unity to me. So what do I mean when I say this room has unity? Well, I mean that it has a lot of impact. It looks as if the design choices have been very, very carefully made. It looks as if the designer is almost following a set of rules with great discipline and clarity. So, for example, very little color in this room at all. Everything is in grayscale except a few ornaments. The textures are quite limited. The whole room gives a feeling of being very, very clean. There's great simplicity to it and elegance. I'm not 100% sure I'd want to live in a room like this, although I like looking at it very much. And I think even the designer, in choosing this red point of contrast here and in adding some natural materials here, some curves and so forth, some squiggles, is revealing a desire for a little bit more humanity or variety in the visual field here that he or she has created. Now, although I like this very much, as I say, I'm not the sort of housekeeper that probably could aspire to this kind of room or would even want to. However, I'm not willing to go this far in the messiness or amount of variety that I'm willing to endure. This is a photograph of an unfortunate victim of hoarding syndrome, his or her kitchen, and there's a lot to look at here. This might be sort of the other end of the continuum. This room is so disorganized and unruly that it's very, very unpleasant to look at, and it's horrible to think of having to live in a place like this, right? So although unity is extremely important, we can see that unbroken unity is perhaps a little bit boring. And although variety is welcome in a very, very unified composition, too much variety, too much information, too much chaos is not very appealing at all. One of our big challenges as artists is to unify a composition and yet allow it to have enough variety to be interesting and compelling. And I like to think of the Cathedral of Notre Dame de Chartres in France as a wonderful example of both unity and variety. I hope you get a chance to visit this cathedral and walk around it and stand inside it. It was created over a period of many hundreds of years by many hundreds of craftspeople and designers, all of whom had similar goals. It was meant to be obviously a religious building, a sacred place of worship, built for the glory of God, but had many different ideas, of course, about how things should look. In fact, the two most prominent towers of the cathedral, of course, as you can see, are very different, and well, they might be. They were created in different centuries by different architects working with different craftspeople. Once you get closer to the cathedral, you'll see that everywhere there are sculptures, beautiful sculptures of the saints and apostles, tiny little vignettes, gargoyles, all sorts of decorative stonework everywhere. It's a riot of detail and information, but nowhere do we get that feeling of messiness that we got when we looked at the messy kitchen a minute ago. The information is organized, and there are organizing principles that give it soul. The Rose Window of Chartres, of course, one of the most famous artworks in the world, only one of dozens of gorgeous stained glass windows in this cathedral. Again, a medium that's entirely different from the stonework around it, and yet they all seem to fit together seamlessly. I would say that Notre Dame has what I call soul. In other words, it seems to be one unified human expression, the expression of one human soul, maybe, although I know that it's not. So this is the unity variety problem. I'm calling it a dialectic here because although we'll talk about it in our critiques as if it were a continuum, saying this piece is a little more to the unity end, or this piece is a little more to the variety side, what we really need is both. And they work against each other. So it's very, very difficult to get both. So we'll say that unity will generally give you a work that has great dramatic impact. Variety will generally give you a work that requires you to get up close, that makes you say, I'd like to stand closer to that. I'd like to spend some time looking at it. Works that have a lot of unity are generally pretty easy to understand and grasp. They're often quite simple, but designers often have to organize complex information, and they have to figure out a way to get all that variety into a work that still has some unity. Works that have unity often seem to have a lot of discipline, as if the artist or designer has been willing to limit himself or herself, say, to a very narrow palette. Works that have a lot of variety tend to have a generous feel to them, as if the artist has poured out everything that he or she can think of, often to the point of maybe unruliness or diversity. One thing that really gives a work a feeling of unity is a feeling that we can see the rules that the designer has worked under, whether conscious or unconscious. These rules tend to give unity to a work of design. And so I'm going to say this is my best definition for unity. It makes a piece look to be the work of one human soul, whether it really is or not, as in the case of Chartres, might be the work of hundreds of human souls. Variety means that we have incorporated lots of information. It can even mean that various points of view are incorporated. This is a difficult thing to do, but it's often necessary. And you'll find out if you go on to work as a designer that often a client will come to you with a bucket full, a bathtub full, a train car full of information that they want you to incorporate into a web design, a brochure, and yet you've still got to give unity to all that information. So the problem with unity is that it can seem boring, it can seem sterile, it can seem a little bit predictable, perhaps, right? Not if it's done well, of course. The problem with variety is that it can seem chaotic or messy or arbitrary, where we feel that there is no governing impulse or desire or rule. But if it's done well, of course, we won't feel any of those things. So I'd like to look first of all at an example that I think gives a nice balance of unity and variety. This is a very typical English country garden, and I think most people look at something like this and find it very appealing. People often describe country gardens as being a riot of color, and there will be many, many different types of flower, often arranged in ways that seem at first glance very, very natural. However, it doesn't seem messy or disorganized. It doesn't seem predictable either, but it doesn't seem chaotic. It hits a nice line, I think. And let's look real quickly at what's really going on here. Is this a riot of color or not? Actually, the basic background color is green, and then there are some pinks, some sort of salmony pinks here, some more purpley pinks here, and some violets, right? These are lavender plants, so I guess I shouldn't call them violet, but there really is a fairly narrow range of warm colors in this design. Pretty much everything else is green or gray. So there has been some kind of limit imposed here. There could be a bunch of yellow daisies or something, but the designer, or at least the photographer, has chosen to leave out colors in the yellow and orange range and to give us a slightly more limited palette. That might not be something that you're consciously aware of, or even that the gardener was not consciously aware of. Those are questions of taste, and those questions tend to unify a composition. What else about this garden makes it seem different from that messy room? For one thing, these are flowers. They're not dirty socks or old boxes of macaroni and cheese, right? There's something beautiful, and there's something that takes a lot of care. And that's obvious to us on a subconscious level, even if we don't bring that to consciousness. We know that somebody has weeded and fertilized and watered and planted and babied these flowers in order to get them to bloom all at once like this in this beautiful array. We also see that there are pathways through this composition, and literally pathways through the garden. So the garden is organized so that we can move through it. We can reach a goal here, and then we can move beyond that goal to another goal. And those feelings of being able to move through a composition in an orderly way directed by the designer's mind are very satisfying, as we are finding out. So those are organizing principles that, as I say, may be beneath consciousness right now, but we're going to try to bring those to consciousness. And in doing so, we're going to look at the principles of Gestalt. Gestalt is a term from psychology, which means unified whole. And it refers to the theories of visual perception developed by German psychologists in the 1920s. These theories attempt to describe how people tend to organize visual elements into groups or unified wholes when certain principles are applied, which we're about to learn. So in a nutshell, Gestalt means the concepts that make unity and variety possible in a design. These two things that work against each other, we're going to bring them together in our designs using the principles of Gestalt. Gestalt theory is really valuable for designers because it helps us understand where visual organization starts. It gives concrete evidence to how the eye organizes visual experiences. You could sum up Gestalt theory by saying that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So we are going to learn to organize things in such a way that we achieve a unified whole that has more meaning, more impact, is more compelling for the viewer than the individual parts would have predicted. Just as this little arc and these dots mean a whole lot more when they're put inside the circle, when they're contained within that circle. So, Gestalt is about perception, and much of what we experience when we perceive things is below our consciousness. We're going to try now to raise our perception experiences to consciousness and examine them. When I show my students this slide and ask them what that is, everybody says it's a cow. Nobody has ever yet said that is two halves of a cow leaned up against a post. And yet, that is literally what we see. We really see two halves of a cow with a post dividing them, right? We know, however, through experience, that the cow isn't in two pieces. His body continues behind the post. Beyond simply knowing this, our brain actively fills in what we don't see. Now, this may seem too obvious to even be worth talking about, but remember that you had to learn this. There was a time when you didn't know it, and anybody who's ever played peekaboo with a baby will realize this. Babies are amazed when they discover that someone who's disappeared behind a blanket is still there and can come out again. Babies don't take it for granted that the thing that they can't see could still be there. We have to learn this. Once we learn it, it becomes subconscious. And now we're going to think about how we can bring those things back to consciousness and use them. We call this particular principle of Gestalt closure. Closure occurs when an object is incomplete or a space isn't completely enclosed. If enough of the shape is indicated, people will perceive the whole by filling in the missing information. So let's take a look at some examples here. This wonderful logo of the panda is not a complete panda. Most people recognize this as a drawing of a panda, but it's not completed. In other words, the lines that would finish off these shapes have not been drawn. The white face of the panda is allowed to sort of bleed out into the background behind it. And I'd like you to do a thought experiment and pretend that those lines have been drawn. Is this a better design? Most people, when I ask them that, say no, they like it the way it is without the lines there. They like the fact that the designer has trusted us on some level to complete those shapes. Your experience of completing those shapes was subconscious, I'm betting, before I pointed it out. But the designer knew that you would be able to do that. The designer had to think about that first. Similar thing happens whenever you see an image created out of small pieces. Our brain easily puts those pieces together and compiles a whole image out of them. And what happens here? When I ask people what's pictured in this square, most people say it's 3 black circles with a triangle on top. But of course, the triangle isn't really outlined. The triangle is implied by the angles cut out of these circles, and these aren't really circles. They're really kind of a Pac-Man shape, right? We automatically call them circles because our brains close that shape. That's closure, very powerful Gestalt principle, which I hope you will be using this quarter. Here's another example of Gestalt. Maybe you've had this come in your email. I've had it come a couple of times in my email. I'm going to read it to you. It says at the top, can you read this? If you can read this, you have a strange mind too. Can you read this? Only 55 people out of 100 can. I don't think that's true. I think almost everyone who reads English can read this. Let's go on here. I couldn't believe that I could actually understand what I was reading. The phenomenal power of the human mind is such that according to a researcher at Cambridge University, it doesn't matter in what order the letters in a word are. The only important thing is that the first and last letter be in the right place. The rest can be a total mess and you can still read it without a problem. This is because the human mind does not read every letter by itself, but the word as a whole. Amazing, huh? Yeah, and I always thought spelling was important. The principle here, of course, is, again, closure. If the first and last letter of a word are there in the context of a sentence, we can figure out, our brains subconsciously figure out what the word means as long as everything's provided. It will reorganize the letters to help you see the word that's intended. And no, I don't intend to write all my lectures this way. Another important Gestalt principle is grouping. And there are many ways of grouping. Grouping by location, orientation, shape, texture, color, size. Most of what we're going to study about Gestalt will be concerned with grouping, how groups are formed, and what effect they have on perception. The stronger the grouping, the stronger the Gestalt. It is this grouping that contributes to unity in a design, and you will see this everywhere you look, including, I trust, your own bedroom or desktop. So let's just look at this poster. You may take it for granted, but all the items in this poster are organized by their color. They're all black, which of course reinforces the theme of the poster here. They're organized by location. In other words, we see these items as having to do something with each other, and we see these items as having to do something else, something possibly secondary, since they're more off to the side. They're organized by orientation the same way. These items seem to be meant to be read first because they're oriented so that we can read them first. These seem to be secondary because they're oriented in a different way. They also create a visual texture, which helps to group them separately. Let's see, they're oriented by size, of course. These, or rather grouped by size, excuse me, these are much bigger, and therefore subconsciously we think this is what we're supposed to read first. These are smaller yet. So all of these things help to make sense of the information in the poster. Grouping is important because the visual world is so complex that the mind has developed strategies for coping with all the information around us, all the confusion. The mind tries to find the simplest solution to any problem, and when the viewer's mind looks at your composition or your design, the viewer's mind is going to try to make sense. Grouping will help you communicate with that viewer. Grouping will help them make sense. So here's an example of grouping by location, very, very simple. Grouping by orientation, grouping by shape. So a viewer might first of all, these are also grouped by value, of course, so the viewer might first of all see that this rather puzzling composition has a little bit of a key to it. All the square shapes have one value. All the triangular shapes have another value. So these are the sorts of things that viewers will notice or look for, although almost always on a subconscious level. Another Gestalt principle that is very powerful is similarity. Similarity allows us to form Gestalt, form a whole that is more than the sum of its parts, when objects that may be very different look similar to one another. They'll be perceived as a group or a pattern, and this imparts great unity. So think about this little logo here for a moment. It's got a sun in it and an eagle. Close your eyes and imagine the sun. And now imagine an eagle. And I'm betting that the two images in your head look nothing like each other at all. The eagle and the sun visually have almost nothing in common. And yet, this designer has found a way to stylize them both and produce these triangular shapes at the bottom of the eagle that sort of correspond to the pattern of the eagle's feathers, stylize the rays of the sun so that they are not only very similar, but that they fill out or complete a radial pattern. It gives the design great unity and is much more compelling as a visual image than a picture of the sun and a picture of an eagle, say a photograph next to each other, could ever be. Similarity is a great way to unify things. There are varying degrees of similarity, of course. Objects can be extremely similar, which gives great unity, although it may be boring. And objects can have lots of similarity, but some difference, which can also give great unity, possibly without being so boring. So here in this Chelman's drawing, it's untitled, but the word ocean is there in parentheses after it. We see forms that are very, very similar, repeated over a 14 by 18 inch plane. And they're not completely uniform. For example, the waves, if that's what they are here in the front, are much larger than the waves in the back. The waves in the front are darker. The waves in the back are lighter. There seems to be some difference in them, so that we see some places where it seems like maybe a current is forming, or larger waves are kind of grouping themselves together out of this watery surface. So there's enough difference, there's enough variety here to make us look a little bit closer. Ask yourself if there's enough variety for you in this composition. Ask yourself how this composition might be more unified, right? You could stylize these waves and make them exactly the same all over the page. You'd have something much more like a pattern. You could put a sailboat in the middle of this composition and make the waves much, much less important, right? A lot of these questions are questions of taste, again, and different people are going to come down in different places in this unity-variety dialectic, and that's why we need lots of artists and designers. But Maybe the person who really loved that high-tech room that I showed you in the first slide and would adore to live in a house like that would like to have a picture like this on his or her wall. Maybe for some of us there wouldn't be quite enough variety in this picture to hold our interest or to make us look at it over and over again every day. But that's okay. These are questions of taste. One thing that I love about similarity is that it gives us a chance to surprise people. You have to have some kind of pattern or rhythm set up to lull people into predicting what's going to happen next. And then when you break that expectation, you can surprise them. This creates a center of interest, it creates lots of variety, and it also can give a piece a little bit of an emotional tone, maybe a sense of humor. Proximity is another great Gestalt principle. I could describe these two compositions in exactly the same way. I could say there's a white rectangle with 9 black squares on it. Whoops, I think there might be 10 on this. Anyway, the point is that they're pretty much identical in terms of what's in them, but they're very, very different. They're nothing like each other, right? This one is a little bit boring because it's got too much variety. It's a little hard to understand why those squares are sprinkled around the way they are. This one might be boring because it has so much unity. Neither one of these is very exciting compositions, but they do show the amazing gestalt that proximity can impart. Proximity is even more powerful when edges get very, very close. The general concept for proximity is that the closer items are to one another, the more likely they are to be seen as a group. And this is a problem for typographers and text designers all the time. And you can see in this unfortunate use of proximity here that an unintended gestalt was created. The spaces between letters and the spaces between words are a very, very important place to pay attention to proximity and close edge. When two edges actually touch, we can get images that are even quite disparate, very, very different from each other, fusing to create a new form or shape that can be very exciting. When shapes overlap, a very, very strong gestalt is created. Overlap is a powerful way of getting not only space into a design, but a feeling of gestalt, so that two items can make a more complex shape, as they do here, even though we can hardly see the overlap because they're the same value, or to actually produce an illusion that they're floating above each other. When overlap is complete enough that the objects feel that they're combined, the items are grouped so strongly that it will tend to set them apart from the rest of the information around them. So for example, when you look at the little black objects inside this red square, or the red objects inside this black square, they seem to be in a relationship that gives them more importance than some of the other objects in the composition. There are many ways to combine items. You can underline them, you can put boxes around them, you can put them against a background. But the important thing to see is that items that are grouped will tend to stand out. So if you look at the pieces here of the smiley face that we looked at before, notice how the smiley face itself seems to have so much more impact in that little strip. Containment is a unifying force created by the outer edge or boundary of a composition. And this is the format that we keep referring to. This is one reason why it's so important to me that you work in the templates that you're given and retain that edge so that we can really see how the objects that you're composing are reacting and interacting with the edge of the format. So you'll see that these are all the same objects in each composition. Very, very different compositions though, because of the way the items are cropped by the boundary edge. Continuity, sometimes called continuance, is one of the Gestalt principles that you'll be using in this composition, because one of the things that you're going to be asked to do is to create a feeling of linear motion possibly through the use of shapes. Whenever you group things in a line like this, they tend to draw the eye in a line. And from the perspective of the viewer, that's a sort of an implied motion or movement, which is very satisfying in a composition. Which Gestalt principles are in play here? Well, I'll give you a clue, almost all of them. What you might do is take a look at the document Elements and Principles of Design, which you'll find in Canvas. The last page lists the Gestalt principles that we've covered in this lecture, and it would be a good exercise to go down that list and see how they work in this particular logo design. Some of them you'll find yourself thinking, perhaps, that they're so obvious that you would take them for granted. For example, these figures are all grouped by color. They're all black. But imagine that each one of them was a different color of the rainbow. That's a choice that the designer might have made. And think how that would affect the unity of this design, or the variety of the design. We'll be using these principles of unity and variety and the principles of Gestalt to critique and strengthen your sketches and develop them into your final Illustrator rendering for assignment 2. Finally, make sure that you use this new vocabulary, the principles of unity, variety, and Gestalt, when you're writing the essay that will accompany your final piece. Hope this gives you a lot to think about as you develop your design. Good luck. I am really looking forward to seeing the results.